Good to be here for the panel on global state of play on climate reporting. 10 years ago, I was here for a global investigative journalism conference and at ETSA Shangri-La, and there was a panel on climate, like this one. And those are innocent times. We were all very optimistic that things could happen. Crisis was brewing, but we were optimistic. And a year later in Paris, the world governments got together at COP, at the climate summit, and gave a target of 1.5 degrees above industrial average by 2050. And here we are, 10 years later in 2024, and we're nearly already reaching 1.5. So, and all the signs of the last 2 years, a record-breaking heat in Europe, this year in the subcontinent, across North America, the wildfires, the coral bleaching, the more intense hurricanes and cyclones and typhoons, and the extreme weather, either no rain at all, winter droughts, or too much water and floods. So if this is what happens with 1.5, imagine 3.2, which is what the projection is by 2050. And even that we might probably reach by 2035. This conference is called Future of Facts. And yesterday we did discuss what the challenges of disinformation are. But this is also the future of the climate emergency. And we've come from ignorance about what's happening to the climate, to denial, to skepticism, and now we're reaching some kind of a climate anxiety, climate stress, doom and gloom, and the hopelessness almost bordering on apathy, and where the media fits into this dilemma of the future of facts. And as we heard yesterday, what do you do on climate, on reporting on climate, when facts don't matter? When what scientists are saying don't matter? The flat earthers are just denying what they see around them for political, ideological, or whatever reason. And we're all in the same boat. Yesterday we heard about the threats to democracy and press freedom from populist social media, but so is climate activism. Yesterday we also heard a lot about AI, artificial intelligence, and believe it or not, there's a link. The kind of turbocharged energy demand of the data centers and the server farms that are, like for example in Ireland, AI servers are taking up 30% of the electricity of the national grid of Ireland. And this is going to be repeated in other European countries as well as countries like India. And it's not just electricity, it might be from renewables in Europe, but in other countries it will be from thermal power plants powered by coal. So AI and the crypto servers, their energy demand is directly linked to what we're talking about now. So with the panel today, we'll be looking at how do we cover solutions, how do we prevent the hopelessness from becoming apathy and fatalism. And we have to choose between AI or AC. And I noticed that the air conditioner here The air conditioner here makes me feel perfectly at home because it feels like I'm 3,000 meters up in the Himalayas. So we'll also be talking about solutions. And I've been a journalist now for, I won't tell you how long, but I've been reporting on climate for 30 years. And it looks like media, the way we do media, is not enough. The rules of journalism that make you give equal column inches or teletime to both sides is probably what got us into this mess and led to this kind of apathy as well. They did a survey in the US, and this is true for other parts of the world, where 8 years ago, 70% of the people surveyed said the climate crisis is a problem. Today, it's down to 60%. So something we're doing is not right. Also, the problem is that the climate crisis coincides with a crisis in media, what we call the mainstream media. People are getting the message through devices and not necessarily from our content or the content we produce as climate journalists. So we need to tackle this as well. The way we'll do this today is that I will introduce the panelists one by one before they speak, and we'll go in alphabetical order as it is in your brochures. We first have Imelda Abaño. She's a program manager for the Philippines and Asia Pacific for Internews' Earth Journalism Network. Many of you might have heard of it. She's an environmental journalist and a media trainer who has been covering climate change, biodiversity, wildlife trafficking for the last 25 years. Internews' Earth Journalism Network she's been managing and leading various activities and projects in the Philippines and the Pacific region. Imelda, you go first. And you have a presentation. Yeah, please.
You want me to present?
Yeah, you can go up to the stage. Oh. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Good afternoon, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Okay. I think as we are going to lay down our discussion today, I want to present to you the study that we had, like, for 1 year already, the Covering the Planet, and we assess the state of climate and environmental journalism globally. So this discussion on the state of climate and environmental journalism globally is timely as we launch early this June a study that brings into light some of the challenges and needs of journalists doing crucial role in covering the planet. So we work with a team of researchers from the Deakin University in Australia, and we incorporated, of course, the voices and insights of 818 journalists in over 100 countries, including the Philippines and countries from the Pacific region. So as you see, journalists who investigate, curate, and analyze climate and environmental information play a crucial role in building public understanding of these pressing problems. But these are challenges identified. Of course, number one is more funding, more training, more safety for journalists, more access to sources, and more expert connections. So let me let me just share with you, this is a 100-page study, but let me just share with you some of the highlights of what we found on climate reporting globally that we just launched early this month. So journalists perceive the coverage of climate change and environment has increased over time, mainly due to the increase in problems related to environment. So it's plastic pollution, ocean acidification, and to a lesser extent due to increasing public interest. Journalists reported overwhelmingly 82%. That climate and environmental stories now have more prominence relative to other subjects than a decade ago. So journalists noted overwhelmingly that a lack of resources limits their coverage of climate and environmental issues. So that's 76%. And next, of course, the misinformation is problematic, and climate and environmental reporting is also complicated by this misinformation. So 58% of journalists surveyed said that misinformation had increased in the last decade, and the source of the misinformation was overwhelmingly social media. That's 93% of journalists observing this one. So it's pretty much high in the social media era. And then to increase their capacity to report on climate change and environment, journalists report the top 5 priorities for assistance as being more funding for in-depth journalism, in-person training and workshops, fellowships to attend conferences such as the climate change international negotiations, more access to relevant data, and better access to subject experts. And also across almost all countries, journalists said a health frame was how they were mostly likely to approach their climate and environmental coverage. Just remember that we had the pandemic, so most likely in the past, we have an intersection of climate, environment, and health issues. And the top 5 themes journalists reported on were deforestation, water and sanitation, water pollution, and government policy and plastic pollution. So I just gave you like an overview of what our 100-page study on how journalists report on climate change issues globally. Thank you.
Imelda, wonder if your survey looked at the target groups. Like there is more coverage of the climate crisis with more urgency, but are we preaching to the converted? Are the people who are reading, looking at, viewing our content already the believers? Or otherwise, how do we get to the other side, the deniers, the skeptics, the ones who we really need to get to? Because increasingly I feel like we have a captive audience of people who already agree with us.
Yeah, I think the science is clear, and the world is really in a state of emergency, and journalists have to put an emergency gear into reporting. And I think in the Philippines context and in the Pacific, we have not really reported on skeptics or skepticism in our reporting. It's because we feel the urgency for climate action, and we feel that we are really on the front line of climate change. So I think it's for us, for journalists, of course, the coverage is really on increasing or raising the awareness of or educating the public, and of course the public interest on climate action.
Thank you. We can go into this a little later as well with the panel. Our next speaker is Sharada Balasubramanian. She's an independent environmental and development journalist from India. Sharada is an international award-winning environmental and development journalist. She has published solution-oriented environmental stories on water, agriculture, climate change, wildlife conservation, and energy. Her works have appeared in Al Jazeera, The Guardian, Climate News Network, Deutsche Welle, Dhaka Tribune, and other outlets. Sharada, I'll just maybe start off with a question about media messaging. Us in the legacy media, and even you as a freelancer, the mainstream press is now losing a lot of its audience, its significance. As I was saying earlier, people are getting the news through their devices. The attention spans have really become shorter. And so it becomes even more difficult for us to explain the complexity of climate science to a larger public, let alone to politicians and policymakers. How do you deal with that?
A very warm good morning. Actually, it's a good question because I started my career almost 2 decades ago. And and I know how difficult it was when I first ventured into journalism. There was no environment reporting. I'm talking about 2004. So from there to starting my career with journalism, and then probably it took like 3 to 4 years for me to even publish my first story. That was that era. But today, I see so much of information overload on climate. And I see on my email box, like every day, getting multiple press releases on this happened due to climate change, that happened due to climate change. But then how much of information do you assimilate, and how much of it do you actually fact check those? It's become a very, very crucial challenge. And I think as far as I remember, it was the 2004 tsunami that really was a game changer with respect to media. I think that's when we saw a front page headline about a disaster. But I really do not remember now whether they referred to it as a climate change. Perhaps it was just disaster. But I think in today's scenario, even I would say that if you are looking at a scientific paper, I think it's very important to look at what are the parameters that specific researchers have taken into account while they are talking about a data interpretation or conclusion. I think it's time to question more than before, to validate and to do more of fact-checking. I think that's where we are right now. And coming to your question, I think content, when we generate as a reporter, I'm sure we talk to various sources for information. But when we try to, I think the information dissemination has changed now, because we not just write, okay, I will only do a 3,000-word piece, or I will only do a documentary. How do you break it down and make it available for audiences of different age groups, for different sectors? I think that's where we are right now. And I think journalists are also getting into a lot of multitasking and learning new skill sets. Because from print to online, and I learned, I took up photography, so I can do photojournalism. I learned podcasting so that I can do audio stories. So when I go to the field, mostly I just go alone, except when I'm taking videos. So I took a workshop in mobile journalism from Internews. Then I did a podcast training workshop from the US. So it was a various skill set training, I think, that's needed today. We can't just say that I can only write, no, but I need to know how to disseminate my information in different ways. Yeah.
So you taught yourself multimedia and packaging your very complicated story into easy to digest messaging through social media as well. I just wanted to ask you, there's a problem in my country, which is neighboring yours, which is that we tend to blame everything on climate change. Someone mentioned over coverage of climate. There are parts of Nepal, for example, that have always been food deficit because of the lack of government investment in irrigation and other agricultural inputs. But now it's become very convenient excuse for the government to blame food shortage in those areas on climate change. oh, this is all climate due to the climate. Do you get that in your reporting, and how do you deal with it?
Well, it's true. And one thing I realized is if you're not sure that it is happening because of climate change, I would say journalists should just stick to their stories and just tell the stories instead of telling this is because of climate change or that is because of climate change, unless it's validated and confirmed by various sources. I can give you an example. I think 2017, we had a worst drought probably in a century to the part of the country that I belong to. And various media, even including international media, were talking about increasing farmer suicides because of climate change. So I actually went to some 11 villages over a span of 3-4 days to the coastal zones and to find out, is it really climate change or what is it? So when I spoke to villagers, I spoke to farmers, I spoke to people who are working with different NGOs and scientists, I found out that this is climate change. Okay, of course, we agree that the rainfall was less, but even people who are experts in assessing rainfall data, they said that the rainfall pattern changes in 3 years, in 5 years it's different, 1 year it's deficit, 1 year it's surplus. So do we say it's climate change? I don't know. Honestly, I don't have an answer. But what I figured out that during that story, that a lot of farmer suicides were misreported in the media, including the popular international media. And I remember a particular publication from Italy had come. They said that they wanted to cover farmer suicides. And they found out that they approached me and asked, can you share some sources, where we can actually see what is happening? And there were some 6 journalists when I told them what was happening. And they said that, okay, none of these sources can be verified, so probably we should drop the story. But the same story was, they dropped it, but many other international outlets carried that story. Actually, it's not just drought, but there are religious problems, there are social problems, and they say that even the shift in cropping pattern, what farmers did, a scientist was telling me that the soil quality, what you grow on that depends on the soil quality. So as journalists, we need to ask, are we growing the right kind of crop in the right kind of soil? If we are doing that, then probably the impact could be reduced. Or what could we do to mitigate? I saw that farmers were shifting from paddy to, say, cotton, which can grow in saline water and also with less water because, we had groundwater depletion. So I think there are lots of myths that we say this is climate change, that is climate change, but unless we are sure of it, I think it's best not to use the word climate change and just report the story as a problem and probably adding a line of what a solution could be.
Yeah. This year there's been a real problem in North India, Pakistan, with the heat wave. We've had 45 degrees, which used to be okay for 1 or 2 days, but it has lasted weeks and sometimes even a month, with the minimum temperature not going below 35 degrees. How is the media in India covering this, and are they looking at it as an annual event where we have heat waves anyway, or is this really, is the alarm being sounded by the media?
I think the alarm is being sounded. I think every day, whether it's social media or any digital media or newspapers, I think heat wave is covered to a large extent now. And I think it's a global thing that's happening everywhere in the world. And I think the media is covering it pretty well from what I see. And I would also like to say that I think it's this is something that I would like to add. When we talk about or report about a heat wave or an incident, we could also go a step further and probably ask the policymakers or people who are involved in probably addressing this problem. To talk about what exactly are they doing to help these people who are impacted by heat wave. I think that would be a good point because I just see that there's heat wave and so many people are getting affected by it. But maybe have a line or two on what the government is doing about it, locally, state or panchayat or nationally. Or I think that will be, and where can people go for help? I think that's where we come to the solution part of it. Like what can people do? Yeah, I think that's where we are largely missing out. We are just talking in numbers. We are just talking facts. We are just talking the problem, but we are not talking about who is addressing the problem, how they are addressing it, and are they addressing it well. I think as journalists, we have the right to question, and I don't think we are using it optimally. Yeah.
So we're covering heat waves as an emergency, maybe not enough, but at least as it's happening right now. But more and more demographers and scientists are predicting mass migrations in the coming decades as people move to higher latitudes or higher altitudes to escape the heat, at least for part of the year. And we can already see trends of this in many parts of the world, including in North India. In my own country, Nepal, where there's been migration of people from the mountains to the plains in the south for decades. That migration pattern might actually be reversed in the coming decades because it's just too hot to live and grow crops in the plains. And speaking of the mountains, I was just reminded of a mountaineer friend of mine, Dawa Sherpa, who's climbed Everest 4 times. And we were talking for a story on how the climate crisis has affected mountaineering in the mountains. And he was saying that it's become much more dangerous to climb now because of more frequent avalanches, and also that your crampons are now scraping rock rather than climbing on ice, which used to be easier. Dawa himself is half Nepali and half Belgian. His father is from Nepal, and his mother is Belgian. And he's become a climate activist because of what he's seen on the mountains. And I asked him, so what made you a climate activist? You're an adventurer, sports person. And he said, well, I don't want the ice that is melting in my father's country to drown my mother's country. And that was what's prompting him as a very personal thing for himself and for something that he sees every time he goes out to the mountains. And Everest Base Camp, for example, today is 50 meters below where it was when Hillary and Tenzing climbed Everest for the first time in 1953. So that's how much the glacier has not just receded, but shrunk, and the ice mass loss. And this, of course, is not just an aesthetic problem that the mountains are losing their snow, and the Alps is seeing this even worse than the Himalaya now. It's also a problem for downstream countries. A report came out this week, a scientific journal, which said that what the ice loss means for downstream Asia, because most of Asia's big rivers start in the Himalaya or the Tibetan Plateau. That brings us to the ocean, because when this ice melts, you have ocean expansion. And our next speaker is from Sāmoa, Lagipoiva Cherelle Jackson. I don't know if I pronounced that right. And what brings us together also is that we were fellow awardees 2 years ago of the East-West Center Media Awards. And I'm just going to introduce you very briefly. Cherelle is the first Pacific Islander recipient of the Journalists of Courage and Impact Award at the International Media Conference by the East-West Center in 2022 in Honolulu, for her work covering Samoa's political crisis. Cherelle is also leads the Solutions Journalism Network's work on climate solution journalism. Prior to this role, she was the inaugural climate collaboration editor for Associated Press. Cherelle, please.
Thank you, fellow moderator and Talo Falava. we have a minor problem, and the climate crisis is a problem, and I've come up with a solution while I'm sitting here. The minor problem is the clicker has been left at the podium. The solution is, Raya, if you will, please.
And while I
am taking my chiefly privileges and asking for the clicker to be passed to me instead of me walking back and forth. Thank you. So see, this is the collaboration among nations and among journalists. So thank you. That was my presentation. So also as the first Pacific Islander journalist to take the stage since the beginning of this conference, I would like to say talofa lava, talofa. And that's aloha in Samoan, which is talofa. So when our ancestors were sailing, because they reached Samoa first, just so you all know, Samoa was the first Polynesian country to be inhabited. And then we sent the canoes forward to Hawaii. When they reached Hawaii, the T and the F were replaced, and so therefore it became aloha, which is different. So talofa lava. I would like to first acknowledge the East-West Center for the privilege of being here. Thank you, Suzanne. Susan, Anne, Ansgar, very grateful for the continued engagement over the years and the acknowledgement of Pacific journalists. I have noted with such pride that there are more Pacific journalists in the audience today, and so I just want to acknowledge that and encourage that behavior moving forward. So I speak as a Samoan journalist, as a Pacific Island journalist, having covered the climate crisis on the front lines for over 20 years. I was 19 when I worked for the daily newspaper, the Sāmoa Observer, and since then I've covered climate across the Pacific, and in the past 4 years I have been covering climate and working on climate issues from the US. So it's a shift in perspective, and my work with the Solutions Journalism Network involves training journalists globally on reporting on climate solutions. So when I speak, I am wearing, you will hear different hats. You will hear me talking as a Pacific journalist or as the director of climates, because the perspective I have is founded on my knowledge and my experience and practice as a journalist in the Pacific Islands. But first, the Solutions Journalism Network. Solutions journalism is essentially a rigorous evidence-based reporting on responses to social problems. In this case, it is environmental problems. I was asked to present on, my perspective of the global trends in climate journalism. Here is a classic. Somehow the slides have decided that they will empty half of it out. Here's the classic historical way that climate has been covered by the media, by the international mainstream media. It is either a polar bear, a white person, or a burning something forest. This is the classic in 3 front pages, depicts to perfection the way that climate has been covered historically by journalists, primarily in global north. If you go to Google News, I went on Google News last night and basically put in climate change, and these are the top hits that came. As you can see, that there is still a trend towards the catastrophizing of the problem. It is a crisis. We should report it as such, but there are other ways to do so. So we went from this to this. It's still there, because often it is still the most sensational and appealing and compelling way to report on climate is to focus on the problem and the negativity. But these are the Pacific trends. These are how Pacific Island journalists cover climate change. If you look at the headlines, it's stories of empowerment, It's stories of solutions. It's centered on people and nature in a way that helps communities. I will talk about these 5 examples just for now. The first one, Awaken New Depths, Safeguarding Ocean Health in the Blue. That was in the Fiji Times. I think this was earlier this year. Classic headline in a Pacific Island newspaper, really focusing on what governments are doing or communities. The second one is a story I wrote for The Guardian, and it focuses on Vanuatu's campaign internationally to address climate change through the international UN bodies responsible for setting the tone on how the climate crisis is addressed as a human rights violation. With that one, it's also a solutions-oriented story. Cook Islands News, looking at a nonprofit featuring how mining can affect communities. And in the bottom, you see the little illustration. This is an ABC series that was done last year, which covered 5 countries and looked at resilient practices in countries. And this particular story was from Fiji, and it was a chief who had decided to, instead of adhering to the indigenous practice of hunting turtles, which is sacred to his community, he utilized his power as a chief and his influence to instead encourage their chiefly council and village to protect the turtles as it is sacred. And this kind of story were often told in local media newspapers. It was often told in small newspapers that are only read in the capital of that small island, or on the radio, or on shows on TV in our small island states. But you'll never really see these featured, say, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago in large newspapers. Because the journalists who cover the stories and make the front pages, as in the first slide I showed, they've never been to that village. They cannot talk to Emosi, and Emosi cannot speak to that journalist in a way that that journalist would understand, because Emosi spoke to this particular journalist, Lithe Movono, in their native language. So the utilization of indigenous knowledge, the empowerment of indigenous journalists, of local journalists, to go into the communities that are coming up with solutions that are centered on ancestral knowledge and indigenous knowledge, utilizing the platforms and the amplification of the news media, international, local, and regional, really amplifies the solutions. So it's really important to understand that this here, the doom and gloom approach, which is a historical trend, still does continue in the global north and in mainstream media. But at the local level and in smaller communities in Asia and the Pacific, journalists have been reporting on climate solutions for many, many years and continue to do so. So I never like to leave without a recommendation or a way forward. And so I feel like the future trend should be this, that we need to invest in training journalists and in giving a solutions lens to climate journalists in order for them to center solutions in their reporting, but in the same rigor that you would apply to any investigative piece. So not to praise or not to hero worship, but to tell the truth and really explore how communities have come up with solutions at the local level, and then amplify that. Collaborations. In my previous role with the AP, I was privileged to forge collaborations between the Associated Press and smaller newsrooms globally in the Global South. And those collaborations really enabled smaller newsrooms to expand the way they cover climate, but also to expand the dissemination of their news. The third is amplification of Asia and Pacific climate journalism. And this is really very much needed because in the room today, there are 4 small Pacific Island newsrooms, right, run by one to 3-person operation. They're covering stories on islands that are hard to reach in languages that are understood by a minuscule amount of people globally. Amplifying those stories and highlighting them will not only create a larger awareness of ancestral knowledge, of community-based solutions, but also just create a better understanding of solutions that are not necessarily centered on what is pushed by the global north. And then finally, targeted support for Global South journalists. This is very, very much necessary, but targeted in a way that responds to the needs of journalists in the Global South. Because often the support that we receive in the Global South is agenda setting for the funders. So lovely that you want to train us on certain things, but it would be also nice if you train us on things that we actually want to learn. So my recommendations, and I really feel that East-West Center is well poised and placed to pioneer a way so that we can have sustainable support and financing towards Asia and Pacific Island journalists. Thank you, Moderator, and I'm open to questions. That time.
I was going to ask you that, what you ended with, as a fellow awardee, and since we're at the East-West Center conference, what can the East-West Center do to help very concretely with, I mean, we talked about training and the need for Global South solidarity, but what can be done immediately and more concretely?
Sure. If I can just have the slide back. If I can just have the final slide back. So the East-West Center is, and I've always praised the fact that this conference exists because it's actually the only conference that brings together Asia and Pacific journalists and media. So it's a very unique platform. Trust me, there's plenty of conferences in America, in Europe, elsewhere, focused on international journalists, but this is the only one that focuses on Asian Pacific. So I feel like the alumni of the IMC is a very valuable group. I think the East-West Center, given its influence, its capacity for resource mobilization, can help in supporting a climate journalism partnership to further amplify, train, and elevate the work of Asia and Pacific journalists. So thank you for asking me the question I asked you to ask me. This is how we work.
I thought journalists never reveal their sources.
I am the source.
Okay, there's a lot of cynicism about solution journalism when we talk to other journalists, especially in the global north and the west. They say, well, journalists are not supposed to be either for solutions or against solutions. We report things as it is. But we see that there are problems with the way the media operates, the formula for news, the fact that only the negative and the sensational makes it to the headlines. And that's probably one of the reasons why there is so much apathy and fatalism about climate, is because we have drummed in this doomsday scenario every day and probably not done enough with those local positive stories. But how do you respond when people, these very cynical journalism professors, tell you that it's not your job to be solution-oriented or oriented in any way?
Right, it's a very valid question, which is why with the Solutions Journalism Network, we advocate for the same rigor you apply to any investigative piece. So you're not hero worshipping, and you're not, just creating an idealistic situation from nothing. The solutions that you cover should still be treated in the same light as any other story. Delve into it, investigate its merits. I think what I'd like to mention here is a lot of the solutions that the scientific community have arrived to now, there's some of them that have been in our ancestral knowledge banks for many, many years. And so the fact that those were not captured or reported upon in recent time meant that those solutions are now repackaged and perceived as solutions that scientists, discovered. So I think that's important to note, that the cynicism will always be there, but the practice of journalism and doing due diligence to the work should take care of that particular problem.
Yeah, I was just reminded of the big oil companies having internal scientists in the 1960s predict very, very accurately what we're going through right now. And those reports were kept buried for all those decades. And only came out now because of some investigative journalism. But the first time climate change, climate crisis, the fact that there is greenhouse effect was first mentioned was how many years ago? Anyone in the audience? First time ever? 1943. 1943. Anyone else? 1960s. 1850. Okay, actually you're closer because it was 1902 by a Swedish scientist who said that all this coal burning is going to lead to a buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it's going to raise global temperature and it's going to cook us all. So it is a bit apocalyptic, but it was 1902. And it was reported in the media. In fact, we have a clippings of, if you Google it, you'll find those clippings in the American newspapers from 1902 of this, quoting this Swedish scientist. Anyway, let's go to the last speaker. Is Alexander Kaufman. He's senior reporter for HuffPost in the US. He's a writer and an award-winning senior reporter at HuffPost, where he covers energy and climate change. He's reported from Asia on issues such as Taiwan's nuclear phase-out, Mongolia's disastrous turn away from nomadic life, and China's rise as a scientific research superpower. He was awarded the East-West Center's inaugural Melvin Gu Writing Fellowship to pursue stories on China's nuclear power industry. Alexander.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, it feels almost unfair to have to follow her, but I'm really humbled to be here, and I thank the East-West Center for this opportunity. And to all of you, I've learned so much from my conversations over dinner and listening to you on stage, and it's quite humbling to be here. Do you want me to?
Yeah, the question you told me to ask you.
They told him to ask this. I didn't. But.
What if Trump gets reelected? What will it mean for the planet? I mean, okay, for the U.S., we know what'll happen. For the planet.
I'm actually a huge MAGA guy, so I think it'll be great. No, obviously not. So I'll first try to take an empirical approach to this, and then speak a little bit more broadly. So there was actually a great piece of analysis that came out from the climate journal Carbon Brief just a few months ago that quantified this very question based upon the projected emissions reductions we are seeing from the policies that the Biden administration has put in place, namely the Inflation Reduction Act, and its almost $350 billion of spending on clean energy. We are also seeing this from the general things that he has put in his platform about what he'd like to do. And what they have essentially calculated is that should he come to power and reverse things in the IRA and implement other policies he's looking to, it will reduce our projected reductions by about 50%. which is catastrophic. And it's even more so if you consider the fact that the Biden administration's policies alone are insufficient to reach the Biden administration's goals. And now we could argue over whether the goals themselves are sufficient, but that alone indicates that the next president, whether that is Biden or Trump, would be responsible for implementing some kind of regulatory regime that would get us further than the policies that we currently have. So I think that illustrates, what would happen domestically, but I don't think that captures the full extent of what his presidency would do. And something that I think about a lot is that one area of advocacy that I think journalists are always responsible for is to be stewards of the democracies that we report on. There is no there's no free journalism in a place where there isn't free speech, and really there's sometimes little point to journalism in a society where you aren't able to mobilize people to vote or to act in civil society to implement some kind of change based on the problems that you are identifying, or perhaps the solutions that you're identifying that could deal with those things. And my fear is that, President Trump, during his time in office, proved himself to be, quite partial to more authoritarian regimes across the world, quite indifferent to democratic norms in the United States, and quite hostile to reporting that challenged, his perspective on things like that. And so my fear is that, we'll not only see from his presidency a recession of, American power and support from the international, collaborative processes that are necessary to deal with climate change. Certainly there'll be less funding for those things. I don't know whether he will truly pull out of the Paris Agreement again, but, we know how devastating that would be. But actually that, we will have an even greater problem ahead of us globally, because we will have the United States flip from being a general supporter not only of climate action, but of greater transparency and democratic accountability. And we are already living through a point in this process where I think we're seeing how limited democracies can be at times in dealing with this kind of change. The rise of China and its capabilities in, not only deploying industrial policy for electric cars and renewables, but as we hinted in my my biography, in nuclear energy and other things, and by contrast, we see in the United States the ability of communities at various levels to challenge and disrupt very low-hanging fruit for decarbonization. Sometimes those democratic processes are good, right? It allows vulnerable communities to voice opposition, perhaps, to policies that are being implemented without their proper buy-in. But at the same time, if that prevents us from carrying out any of the things that we need to, whether that's building solar farms or carrying out more terrestrial mining in the United States, a place where perhaps if we need a lot more lithium or cobalt or things like that, it would be best carried out in places like the US that have high levels of consumption and strong environmental and labor standards, so that burden isn't placed on the global South exclusively. And there are ample opportunities for people for various reasons to challenge those things. And my fear is that without the United States' ability or the West's ability to, respond in kind to the crisis that we have, it will not only see an erosion of our global capabilities to deal with this problem, but an erosion of our abilities to talk about it openly, transparently, and take action on that. And I imagine that given Trump's proclivities for those kind of authoritarian tendencies, that would get worse. Not to be doom and gloom.
So what are we going to do about it? I mean, it looks like to change voting patterns would be the immediate challenge. So we have a green president, a greener president. But to do that, you have to convince the other side, the skeptics. And you have to do this at a time when facts don't matter, where they've made up their minds. It's a political, ideological thing. And I think this is the big challenge for media now is preaching not just to the converted. And just to go back to Cherelle's idea of solution journalism, maybe we are not producing enough solution-oriented content. Maybe we're still talking about and still blaming people so that the ones who are polluting the most feel very defensive. So give me some really positive stories that you've done.
Me?
Yeah.
I'll give you one from just last week. So the U.S. Senate, by a vote of 88-2, passed a big piece of legislation that is meant to make it easier to build and deploy nuclear reactors in the United States. And I bring this up as an example because I think it illustrates another point out of this, which is that I think we have a tendency, especially in covering this, and I've been covering climate change for about 10 years, so we have a tendency to think about the denialists, perhaps the fossil fuel stalwarts as being the primary vectors of misinformation and disinformation, and the skeptics who ought to be persuaded. But nuclear energy is, of course, an energy source that comes with a lot of trade-offs. So is solar, so is wind, so are different types of fossil fuels. And there has been a very strong and long-lasting strain of misinformation that I think has communicated a warped sense of the risks to a lot of voters, and that has primarily come from the political left in the United States. So, I actually see it as a very positive outcome that, the Democrats, in this case, who have been primarily the stewards of climate policy in U.S. politics, have come around to the importance and the benefits of this other energy source, which, not for reasons related to climate change, has been long supported by conservatives and by Republicans. So that kind of unity, while I don't think it's sufficient to, suddenly ignite a nuclear renaissance in the U.S. just yet, is a sign of some unity and an area where we might see some progress, even if we see the party that generally opposes climate action take back power in the U.S.
Any of the panelists want to add to that? Cherelle?
Having the privilege of straddling the two worlds of the Pacific and the U.S., I would like to make a comment on that. On the issue of denialism, and Imelda has alluded to this earlier, I always use this term, and I actually wrote a piece in the Huffington Post about 15 years ago on this. Pacific Islanders and in certain Asian islands, we don't have the luxury of denial, right? Denial is a luxury. You have to have the time, the resources, and a house over your head to be able to deny the existence of a crisis that is threatening people that are not within your socioeconomic status. So I think it's a point that we need to emphasize here, is that the challenge of the skeptics and the deniers don't necessarily exist, in the Pacific Islands. At least I can speak for our communities. So I think there's a lot to learn for journalists in the global north, to learn and understand that just because you have that particular issue in covering climate change in America, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the same for everywhere else.
Imelda, would you like to add something?
One thing for sure is, like what Cherelle has said, one thing for sure is that journalists really wanted to cover climate change excellently. And I think in order to do that, we need collaboration. And Cherelle has mentioned that East-West already has a lot of program on helping journalists to report more on these kinds of issues. Just last two years ago, we had virtual climate change workshop with the Pacific journalists, and they have produced a lot of probing story. One of that I can mention is that 10 years ago, the Narikoso village in Ono in Fiji. So 10 years ago, they're still there in the island. And now, after a story from a local TV, they have been relocated already. So that's how powerful the stories are in the Pacific. And as well as, one of our attendees here, I can mention that he's done a lot of work in the Solomon Islands as well on illegal logging. And after the story was published, two of the timber company were suspended because of that story. And in the Philippines, in Albay, there is a report on the shortage of water, and now after 20 years, they have water. I mean, these kinds of stories that are really not, you're not really mentioning about solutions, but it is. And they are solutions journalism. So there are a lot of opportunities out there actually in better reporting climate change. I can mention a lot of this, like for example, the Asia Journalism Fellowship supported by the Temasek Foundation since 2009. And we had also investigative, the first course of investigative climate journalists in the Philippines from the Asian Center for Journalism. And the Phoebe, who is really excellent in data wrangling. So they have produced a lot of data stories already. And at this point, partnership and collaboration with GMA Integrated News on doing a series of documentaries on digital. And of course, the Puma podcast in the Philippines, they have a lot of series of positive stories on climate and disaster-related stories as well. So if we are going to report these kinds of issues, there's no really part of the skeptics to do their part. And actually, we don't want them to be part of our stories, right?
Thank you. Sharada?
Well, I think there needs to be a strong expansion in what, like both of you said, like there needs to be more of training for solution-oriented stories. I think even in India, it's getting really, I don't know, when we talk about solutions, again, we also receive a backlash. What do you mean by solutions? Even talking just about solutions is biased reporting. You know, that's also the flack that we receive. So it's really to turn around and see, like, okay, if we are talking about, maybe some journalists say that we only have like 200 words that we can write in a newspaper. But what do we write? So even in the 200 words, if you can write one line about something that could make someone think about what's happening, I think that's a game changer. But I honestly think there needs to be more training with respect to solutions journalism. Also, I think in India, in the last decade that I've seen, like even with respect to climate reporting, a lot of editors also look at sensational headlines. So sometimes I'm not happy with the headline. So I say, like, okay, can we have some headline that is no, neither here nor there? I mean, I don't have to say biased, but then doesn't have to be negative or positive, but can we balance or say something that doesn't scare? Because I've seen some of the audience, like not my stories, but some stories that have surfaced in many media outlets, digital media, and they say, oh, Chennai is going to sink by 2030 because of climate change. Is this really going to happen? And I'm like, I don't know whether the city is going to sink or not. So the kind of forecasting and projections that come across and stories that surface from such kind of scientific reports, I think there needs to be specific training on how such science stories need to be reported. I think a lot of training needs to go there. I think I totally agree with you saying that we need a lot of support for the journalists from the global south. I think countries like Bangladesh and India and Nepal and Philippines, the small island nations, I think there's a lot that can be done.
Thank you, Sharada, and thank you, panel. We'll now have questions from the floor. please line up. And while you do, I was just wondering, given that 1/3 of the electricity consumption of a country is now going to be driven by AI servers and data centers, they're going to be consuming so much energy. Wonder if there'll come a time when we'll fly less and not attend big conferences, or switch to electric vehicles, and therefore boycott AI and not use AI at all. Anyway, first question, please.
Hi. Very interesting. I teach journalism at George Washington University and have been coming to this region for 25 years. It's interesting because solutions journalism is really similar to what used to be called public journalism or civic journalism, where we all look for answers. But I often get asked about trainings, and all of you have talked about trainings, and something that has struck me, and I'd love to hear your comments on this, is that we really, my sense is that journalists, I know Indonesia, Malaysia, and Timor-Leste the best, and that journalists don't need to be trained how to report on the environment, but the climate reporting and environment reporting is often part of a whole set of other issues like the law, like corruption, and that journalists know how to report on these things. But, the example from Tempo, when they wrote about a Rio Andolan pulp and paper company, they got sued. And their source was a police brigadier general. They got sued by this company that had huge deep pockets. Of course, the company won. This wasn't a lack of knowledge about how to do environmental reporting. This was a legal problem, a corruption problem. And I just wonder if you all could comment on your...
I see about 15 people waiting in line, so that gives us till after lunch to go on with this session. So very brief questions, very brief answers. Anyone want to tackle that one?
I'll just answer this quickly. A valid point in that I understand your perspective. However, to say that journalists don't need training, it assumes that journalists already have qualifications, academically were trained. In many Pacific Island countries and many Asian countries, the journalists have not received journalism training. And in saying that, in some newsrooms, we don't have the luxury of a beat reporter, right? So in a small newsroom, you would only have 6 people, right? And they're all covering all the stories. And so to train means to really just add that additional skill set so they can perhaps feature more environment stories or more climate stories or perceive the other beats from a climate lens.
Thank you. Next question, 30 seconds.
So, thank you. Can you tell us some of the work that any of you have done on climate finance, which is, I guess, very crucial and a sticking point? Plus, has any of you investigated greenwashing by corporations ever?
Alexander, you want to take that one?
Sure. This a running story that I've covered repeatedly over the years, and thankfully I won't have to cover it again because we've finally reached the point where the developed world has contributed its share to the Green Climate Fund. So I think the last 2 COPs have done a good job of focusing in on this stuff. Getting the right dollar amount to different countries and directing it through different programs. I think is something we're seeing a lot of growth in, and growth, thankfully, from other areas of the world as well. The United Arab Emirates put forward far more money than the United States at the last COP to help countries in the global south with their transition and with adaptation.
Yeah, thank you. Next one.
Hello, my name is Tommy from Indonesia. Are we seeing enough narrative on climate justice in mainstream media? I'm talking about how developing economies, like my home country, we've been struggling to find the good balance between the need and the right to grow, and also meeting the climate change commitments. Are we seeing, and part of it is also, part of the narrative is the need for the developed nations, government of developed nations to do more. Because what I'm saying, for example, specific example, JETP, anything, there's an impasse on JETP, it seems that the narrative is, they always, it appears that the Western media put the blame on the Indonesian government and not understanding the context and also the need and also the struggle and the nuance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Climate justice, is there enough being done?
I think, a lot of media is picking it up now, but again, there are lopsided versions of stories talking about it, again, when we talk about climate justice, like I see a lot of journalists talking to just one part of activists, people who are climate activists, and probably just doing a story from that. So from my experience, even if I talk to climate activists, you really need to make sure to put that perspective across, maybe not saying who is giving that quote, but talk to government officials and find out whether the claims that the climate activists are making can really make it to the news by cross-checking and validating. And from my experience, I also see that a lot of journalists, like when they talk to me, they say that it's very difficult to approach government officials when they want certain piece of news or something like that. But I think in India, we have something called RTI. I have used right to investigation. So those kind of tools to cross-check, validate, verify, and then see if the climate justice proposition that's given by the activists, how does it come across? And
Thank you.
Then write a story.
Thank you. Imelda, you're nodding your head vigorously.
I think in our reporting, we should highlight climate justice and, of course, highlight the common but differentiated responsibilities of each countries and make the West countries accountable in climate change.
Why did you look to the left when you said West? Anyway, next question.
Yeah, June Sepe, ABS-CBN and SJS 2016. I see a line of people who are going to ask questions. And I have a feeling they're going to ask the same line of questions. I like how
just one question.
Yeah, I like how Mr. Dixit started the discussion by framing the question like, yes, we are reporting environmental issues, but aren't we preaching to the choir? Are we reaching the right audience? We at ABS-CBN have done our part in reporting, some of it with the help of EJN. But I find it interesting that we put into the mix here the solutions journalism. Is it the magic wand? And I'm not talking about big words like reducing carbon footprint and everything like that, but really bringing it to the community. So I think the real question is it the right track that would bring the traffic and attention, solutions journalism? Do you have the data for traffic about the reporting that you
thank
did?
you. Thank you.
And hint, sorry, I think you also hinted there that more training and funding, hint, EJN, if you can give us exposure in the Pacific Islands, how they do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Then let's take a bunch of questions right away. Yeah, let's fire them off.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to be hitting two panelists with one turn. Thank you, Imelda, for mentioning GMA Integrated News. I'm from GMA Integrated News. I'd like to zero in on your study, on your survey, saying that 35% cite the need for the need for interest from the audiences, the public, for environmental reporting. So what drives interest? And then for Cherelle, about solutions journalism, what will make it work in the face of realities that legacy media, mainstream media face, the realities of ratings, eyeballs, as mentioned by my colleague from ABS-CBN. How do we make it sorry for the term, salacious or sexy, viable, sustainable? So those are my questions.
One more, and then we go to the answers.
Yeah, what efforts EWC can take to promote solution-based climate reporting?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Please.
Well, these were all solutions reporting, and I think we all agree that East West Center can support us in this. So SJN's model is this. We do solutions reporting trainings for the trainer. So you get your TOT, and then to get accredited as a solutions trainer, you also have to do a training yourself. And we fund you to do that training. So it is a sustainable model in that we equip you with the knowledge and skills and then empower you to go and do this for the rest of, to others in your community. So we have the platform, we have the network and the know-how. We just need to reach our hard-to-reach places and funding to support our Global South, our Asia-Pacific journalists.
Imelda.
And in order to do that, we should upskill ourselves in reporting. Like, for example, the first question of Sir Jun Sepe on more funding, more training. I believe that it's not just a one-time workshop or one-time activity. It should be continuous and elevated. And of course, with the GMA, and we're supporting a lot of news organizations actually in the Philippines. And it's the same way. It's not just a one-shot activity or engagement, but a continuous one where later on they can also train other journalists, even cascading it to the community.
Thank you. Let's take next three.
Yes, I'm Paul from CB, Data Consultancy, and we're EJN's partner in delivering environmental data journalism academy trainings, first in the Philippines and now it's ongoing in India. And I think it's very much closely related to solutions journalism. In fact, in demonstrating both the problems and solutions is also delivering data-driven journalism. But the thing about data-driven journalism, fresh from our experience with the workshops, is that much data is not that accessible. And from the experience of our journalists here in the Philippines and in the previous cohorts, there are major difficulties in urging governments to actually provide us with data, or even other companies and corporations, and we need that data to actually demonstrate environmental impacts. So I guess my question is, are there any tips, actions, or best practices in pushing those who hold these data to actually be more transparent for us to also deliver more progressive climate reporting, more eye-opening data-driven stories, and also probably your thoughts about widening the reach of these kinds of journalism in demonstrating.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for rushing you, but next, please.
Hi, Sam Hurley from the New Zealand Herald. I agree with the apathy towards climate issues, but I also think it's been heavily politicised, and there's also been a backlash in recent years towards expertise and the green movement. So how can newsrooms report on climate issues without being perceived as both partisan or activist and further alienating their audiences?
Thank you. I've got this sign from the organizers, so no more questions. I'm sorry about that. But
the only Pacific Islander in that line. That's the only Pacific Islander in that line of questions.
We'll take one more. That's it.
I am going to advocate.
Talofa tu malolele. My name is Agnes Dubois. I'm from ABC Pacific in Melbourne. Yes, my question is directed to my beautiful Pacific sister, Lagipoiva Cherelle. I do want to ask in the sense of how we report, because I'm going to come from a place of a mother and a journalist. How do we better report in the sense of reaching the next generation? Being able to do better in the way they report, because obviously a lot of times we're reporting for adults to read, but what about the next generation?
Intergenerational climate reporting.
Just quickly, thank you, and I do apologize if I haven't addressed the questions before. I think the way that we should approach climate solutions reporting is the way in which you approach any other story, to make it compelling, to go do due diligence to your reporting process. To answer the question from my sister from Tonga, the way that we can reach the next generation is to tell those compelling stories that have not been heard before, and tell it in a way that they would understand. The utilization of social media, TikTok, unfortunately we do have to use that, in order to reach those other audiences, can connect them to the news. So thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to add very, very briefly?
I want to address the one from Stevie, from Environmental Data Journalism Academy in the Philippines. In order to, if we cannot get access of information from the government, I think there are a lot of other ways, like peer-reviewed studies from NGOs, international NGOs, local NGOs, as well as some journalists who did reports on that already. And CB is doing a lot of data journalism work, and it's an innovative way of reporting climate change. So a lot of information are actually there.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I think with respect to storytelling, right? Like, I think a lot of new forms of mediums are coming in. Like, for children, like, you know, there's something like, I remember reading the Nib from the US, and it, like, supporting comic journalism. So there are various new formats that have come up. So we need to tweak the stories according to different audiences. And I think that's where we are right now. We can't stick to one medium, but to different audiences, different mediums. And how do we do that? That's a challenge.
Well, I'll first echo my esteemed fellow panelist's point from earlier that, you know, greater resources put into organizations that can bring journalists together, you know, across oceans and across borders, I think is critical. It allows us to have a stronger voice to advocate for that kind of transparency, and, you know, creates a more unified kind of standard for talking about these things. And to address the question from the gentleman from New Zealand, you know, I actually want to respond to something that you said earlier about, you know, the kind of false balance that we saw that led to this problem. You know, I think that the answer is still to seek balance, but to seek the right balance. You know, a balance between a conspiracy theory and facts is not balance. That's BS. And if you'll forgive that term, but and you know, I think that there is a real divide that is happening about climate policy. You know, you have people who want to see more radical solutions about how to reorient, you know, global economics or promote ideas about degrowth or greater conservation, and you have people who are looking for other kinds of developmentalism. And I think accurately identifying those as two sides, rather than, you know, people who believe in nonsense and people who are promoting a general sense of reality that includes many different perspectives within it, is critical to gaining that kind of trust. And I've seen little problem with getting people to believe in that when you present it that way.
Okay, thank you. I'm really sorry. It was my mistake. I'm really bad at time management. We're over. You can approach them later at the table over lunch. Thank you very much.